Welcome to episode 63 of Published. Today we're talking to Greenleaf's Executive Editor Erin Brown about finding time to write and publish your book when you're also busy in every other area of your life. Erin will tell us how she supports authors who are struggling with this and gives advice regarding time management related to the book writing process.
Welcome to Published, a podcast by Greenleaf Book Group, where we'll discuss the ins and outs of the publishing industry, from writing a book and finding the right publisher, to gearing up for a book launch. And now, here's your host, Greenleaf Book Group CEO, Tanya Hall.
Welcome back to Published. This episode focuses on finding the time to write your book when you've got a demanding schedule and why it's worth doing so despite the demand it places on your time. Like any significant undertaking that's worthwhile, writing a book requires focus and a plan, but the end result can be life-changing. Let's face it, writing a book is hard. If you're struggling to find the time needed to dedicate to writing your book, this is the perfect time to connect with an editor who can help you navigate the process. Greenleaf's Executive Editor Erin Brown will share how she supports busy authors as an editor and what you can expect in terms of timelines and expectations when it comes to the book writing process. Let's get into the interview. Erin, welcome back to Published. And for folks who are listening to their first episode with you, why don't you give us a little reminder of what you do here at Greenleaf?
Of course. Thank you for having me back. I always enjoy doing these podcasts. Let's see a little bit about me. I have been in publishing for over 20 years. It's crazy to think about. I started out in New York at the traditional publishing houses, and I'm now lucky enough to be back in my hometown of Austin as the executive editor here at Greenleaf. And in my role, I oversee the editorial department. And our editors handle all stages of the editorial process. Some of our authors began with just a nugget of an idea, but no content. And so we help them really create a rough draft. We also do just traditional editing, such as developmental editing, where we're working on restructuring content with authors. And then, of course, copy editing, proofreading. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. We do all sorts of things, including, as well as being a writing coach, we're also cheerleaders for our authors. So we love doing that.
Absolutely. And you're an awesome cheerleader at that. You're the head of the squad.
I enjoy it.
Yeah. So as you well know, we often hear from authors who are really struggling to find the time to write their book because of course, their existing professional obligations or personal life obligations. You know, life just gets in the way. And then that, of course, can lead to them just tabling the idea of writing the book or sticking it in the drawer and forgetting about it, hoping their schedule will clear at some point in their life, and inevitably just finding it too daunting to tackle. So just for context for folks who may be in that situation and to give them a feel for how the rest of the writing world is, can you share with us how common that is and how often you see that situation with the folks you work with?
I would say about 90% of our authors, if not more, are in this position. And, you know, throughout my career, I've told writers the ideal writing conditions will never arrive. And I think this is the biggest trap for all writers when you say, I'll start writing when, and that never happens. And I think that's one of the greatest challenges that you have to overcome is finding the time to write so that it takes a year to write your novel or your book instead of 10 years. However, writers overcome this scenario all the time. So it's about consistency, motivation, focus. It can be done. 90% of our authors do it.
Indeed. And in general terms, assuming that most of our authors do have full-time jobs or they're not full-time writers, basically, can you give us a general timeline in terms of how long it would typically take to write and publish a book?
Well, you know, if you're starting from scratch, as so many of our authors are doing, they'll have an idea, and you have to take into account brainstorming, outlining, writing that rough draft. I usually like to say minimum a year, and that's just for getting the rough draft together, that raw content. There's always exceptions. It depends on your genre, how much research is involved, if you need to stop and quickly restructure your company in the meantime. You know, all of these things come up. And then, of course, once you've completed the rough draft, you can expect another 6-9 months, maybe even a year before the book is printed, ready for bookstores or on Amazon. And that's if you have a publisher lined up. Self-publishing, it can, be a little bit different, but it's an investment of time. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. And to your point, we have seen all types of things come up, not just restructuring companies, but in one author's case, their house burnt down. I think they are still in manuscript development. Quite a setback. We had an author who adopted twins. I mean, just all kinds of things happen. And
yes,
so
life happens.
Life happens to all of us.
Absolutely.
So kind of honing in on just let's just look at the editorial process of that larger process you just described. How much time should the author expect the writing and editing phase to take? And can you kind of walk us through the phases of that?
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned, overall, that writing and editing phase can be about a year. I think when you're talking about writing consistently, we always recommend that writers devote consistent time every day to write if possible. For instance, if you're most creative in the mornings, you might need to get up an hour early, 2 hours early. If you only have time on weekends because you're too busy running a company, for instance, as we spoke about, commit to working for a consistent block each weekend. I think it's important to talk to your family and coworkers and tell them you're not to be disturbed when you're writing. And that can be hard to do, to hold those boundaries. But officially blocking out that time in your schedule, your Google Calendar, I think is really helpful because it's harder to ignore. And you really hold yourself to that consistent writing time. But again, even when you're consistently writing, completing a rough draft can be a year minimum, especially if you're super busy with a day job. But of course, some writers can get into the flow. We've had surprises, super, super busy writers, and they'll finish in 3 months, 6 months. I broke my foot and was laid up in bed for 2 weeks, and I wrote a mystery novel. So you never know. But definitely, if you're brainstorming, starting from scratch, and if you're writing nonfiction, you definitely want to, I always advise, and of course I'm a bit biased because I'm an editor, but you also want to, once you have that rough draft, seek out a content or developmental editor, and you'll want to go back and forth with them a few times for revisions, and that can take a couple months, and then of course, eventually you'll want to copy edit and a proofread, and yes, everyone needs an editor, even editors. So.
Maybe especially editors.
Especially editors, yes.
Now, you mentioned the developmental edit. You and I know that's a very high level edit. I'm imagining that folks who are, again, juggling their very busy lives may think that would slow down their process or somehow get in the way of their flow. So maybe it's helpful to give a little context about that experience and how often an author and editor are touching base in that process, and whether having that editor involved in the very early stages of the manuscript development is indeed a time saver.
Well, I think it's a time saver to get that feedback early on, because you never want to complete a rough draft and then you have someone come in with a fresh set of eyes and say, oh, I would have done that and that and that. And then you have to go back and rework it anyway. So having someone there from the beginning stages, I think, is always helpful. But I also think it ends up being a time saver because ultimately, I feel, and from what I've seen, you finish your rough draft more quickly. You have someone holding your feet to the fire, holding you to deadlines, holding you accountable. Otherwise, it's really easy to extend your completion date forever. Editors and authors can discuss how often they want to touch base. That obviously depends on the author's schedule. But a good rule of thumb, I think, is you're going to be talking more during the outline stage if that's where you're starting. But then you can always just touch base after every chapter, send it back and forth. And this could be every week, this could be every month, whatever's working with your busy schedule. This can also be a quick email. You're not obligated, nor is it necessary to have a long Zoom meeting or phone calls that go on forever. This can just be a back and forth via email. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a lot of time that you're devoting to the communication with your editor, in other words. So the editor will be providing feedback to the author. And as I briefly mentioned, having this fresh set of eyes is so valuable because writers are so close to their work and they often can't see the issues that ultimately their readers will notice. And so the editor is not only providing their writing expertise and their editorial expertise, but they're acting in the role of your target reader. So they're asking the questions that your audience will ultimately ask early on in the process, so that the writer can fix any of those problems, add clarity, all of those things before the book is complete, before it ever finds the reader.
Yes, and I can vouch for for that, having written my own book. And I often tell people when they ask what I learned in that process, I'll tell them I very arrogantly in the beginning said, I don't need an outline because I teach this stuff all the time, and I'm always talking about the book as ideas, influence, and income. And I've been doing this for so long, blah blah blah. And the problem was not that I didn't have enough to write; it was that I, like you said, was too close to the material, and I was going down rabbit holes that the reader wouldn't care about, like distribution logistics. Who cares? I care, but nobody else cares. So I ate crow and went back and worked with the editor to develop a very detailed outline, in fact. And that was a game changer for me, because it meant that, I don't know that I would recommend this actually, but it meant that when the muse visited, I could pop into that outline and decide, you know what, I'm going to write that section today. I'm going to write that section today. Now, why I say maybe I wouldn't recommend that is because I saved all the hard sections for the end and then put off finishing the book forever. But
well, I think that's a great way to do it, because that keeps you moving. If that's something, a tip I always offer is, because save the hard stuff and the details for later, because then you're not going to get bogged down and stop, and just you can handle that along the way down later.
Whatever works for you, right?
Yeah.
But yes, I think I 100% agree, not just on my own experience, but having seen so many authors submit work to Greenleaf that they think is rather done. And then unfortunately, yes, we do have to go back to do some heavy developmental work, and that's kind of heartbreaking for all involved. So
yeah, well, I think that also we as editors, we know how to present our ideas to authors so that they really see we're working with them and we're trying to make their book better. And so when they go, oh yeah, this is going to make it better, this is going to take it to a new level, this is going to provide this for the reader, they're very excited about it. So they don't take it as, oh, well, I thought it was great, it's not. And so it's not a negative thing. It's really we're in a partnership together to take something good and make it even better.
Absolutely. Now, there may be folks who are listening who just cannot possibly envision how they would make time for this process. So can you shed a little light onto some of the ways that you accommodate these very busy folks in terms of how you work with them as an editor?
Well, definitely. I think, again, it's rare that we encounter authors who just have lots of time. So it's usually the case that we need to accommodate very busy authors. And of course, we're very understanding of hectic schedules. And so we follow up on deadlines very kindly, but we do follow up on any missing deadlines, and we're used to adjusting deadlines a little when an author is busy, but we strive to hold firm when possible. But we're not going to make an author feel guilty if they don't make it, but because things happen, and as we were talking about, life happens. But one of the roles of an editor is to hold a writer accountable. And I think that's what an author is ultimately looking for, along with, of course, feedback on their writing, is someone that's going to make sure that they're hitting deadlines, they're moving forward, and again, keeping them motivated and holding them accountable. So that's how we try and be understanding, but we also want to keep those deadlines set and follow up so we can keep these very busy authors moving along.
Excellent. And how about some specifics now? What are the best practices for getting the most out of one's writing time?
Yes. Well, some of the things that I like to pass along, one thing is you can make writing your first thing every day, because one of the best ways to create a new habit is to do it first thing. So if you're one of those people that's really creative in the morning, get up and consistently write. It doesn't have to be for 2 hours. It could be for 15 minutes, but get into the habit of doing something every day if possible. There's always going to be exceptions when you can't do it. Also, I think planning your writing sessions, you can also do it in smaller sessions. Like I mentioned, it doesn't have to be in huge blocks. I think a lot of writers, especially who are busy, get very intimidated. Oh, I don't have a 2-hour block to write, so I just won't do it. But you can have a voice recorder. You can do it on your phone while you're puttering around. You can speak into it, even if it's only a couple thousand words or an intro, your thoughts. So smaller writing spurts are okay when you're short on time as well. Just do it. As we talked about, leave the smaller details for later. Zip through that first rough draft. I always say give yourself permission to write badly for that, because you're just trying to get the raw content down during that first draft. And again, if you have an editor later, they're going to be helping you really smooth it out, get in there line by line, and of course, copy editing and proofreading. So for that first draft, just get it on paper. Also, this can be a really tough one, but it's very important. When you're writing and in the thick of it, cut back on TV and other time-consuming entertainment. It's very tempting to binge watch Game of Thrones, but if you're in the middle of writing, you'll need to devote some of that time to eliminating those distractions and really sitting down and focusing. Also, a great writing environment, I think, is key. A place that's free from distractions is essential. You might think that nice music will work. Sometimes it does, but I find, a quiet place is good. They've also done studies that warmer temperature is more conducive to writing. Some people might think when it's colder, it'll keep you going, but actually, warmer air keeps you from making mistakes, and it also makes a person more generous, which means it could improve the quality of your writing. I thought that was interesting. But definitely also don't write in bed. It could be very comfortable, but it is not conducive for long writing sessions. Also, especially for busy authors, if you've had a very hectic day, give yourself a breather before you're writing. If it's not first thing in the morning, come home, take the dog for a walk, pet your cat, do some gardening, get into a headspace before you then sit down so you can focus on writing. Another good idea, there's lots of apps that you can use to keep track of your writing time. So if you start logging how much you've written and when you've written it, you can start to see a pattern, and then you can figure out when you're more productive. And so yeah, you can Google lots of good apps and find those as well. And I think have a daily plan. So if you kind of like using an outline, if you have a plan for the day, I'm going to write this chapter, I'm going to write 1,000 words, whatever it is, go into it with a plan, and then you have a very reasonable goal that you can reach, and then you have a feeling of accomplishment. So small goals, I think, are also very helpful.
Definitely. And again, I'll sort of double up on some of your advice here, because I learned that whenever I tried to write in the office, I could not. And it made sense once I gave it some thought, because when I'm here, even if I think I'm able to sit down and focus, my mind is constantly scanning. I am always listening to hallway conversations and like ready to go in and help solve the problem, the constant dinging of email, or just the temptation that it's sitting right there. And it's just like you said, the word mindset. It's a different mindset when I'm in the office versus at that time we weren't in our hybrid work environment that we have now. So I would leave, go home. I had a rather uncomfortable chair that I would sit in, and I would tell myself, you may not get out of the chair until you have written 700 words.
That's your goal. There you go. Absolutely. Absolutely. You won't fall asleep and you have a manageable goal.
Yes, because I think, like any human being, we are faced with something difficult and we will look for every opportunity to not do it. So whether for me, that was even at home, of course, I really should do some laundry or anything but do this hard thing. So yeah, I think,
and that's why I think it's really great to make notes, even if you're not using an app. Just write down when you're the most productive, because you can really pay attention to that and start making sure that that's when you're writing, that's how much you're writing, that's the environment you're writing in.
Yeah, that's a good point, because I think even more so than being productive, like when are you particularly good at writing, right? Like we can be productive in different ways, but I know for me, words come easier in the afternoon. And so I've learned many years ago to sort of schedule anything that's an interview, and ideally even a podcast, although this is not the afternoon at the moment, maybe you can tell. I try to push those into the afternoon. I'm just a more verbose, word-oriented person then. And I think the better someone can understand their own biorhythms, then the more likely you can make those accommodations for yourself.
Absolutely. Absolutely. If you're a night owl, stay up late into the night and do it.
Right. Well, you've given us some awesome advice here. Any parting words of wisdom for how to make time for this difficult task of writing a book?
I think just really using the tools that I've mentioned, and just don't use lack of time as an excuse. I know it's really easy to do, but it is possible. Again, so many of our writers have incredibly hectic schedules, and it is possible, though, to make time for writing with planning, consistency, motivation, and setting strong boundaries, I think, with those around you. And I think just to remember that those conditions will never be ideal. And it was funny because when preparing for this, I was thinking of, it's always stuck with me, but my 7th grade history teacher, Mr. Rodriguez, shout out to Mr. Rod here in town. He was a little bit intimidating, but he would always say, life's not fair, you make it fair. And I use that phrase and kind of in different situations, but I think like there's never enough time. You make that time, and it's so true. You just have to do it, and you can do it. And trust me, I've seen it happen time and time again every day. So it's possible. Do it, make that time. You can make it happen.
Awesome. Very inspiring. Thank you, Erin, for joining us once again on Published. We appreciate your help.
Of course. Pleasure.
That's it for our episode today. We hope we were able to give you some reassurance and guidance related to finding time to write a book. For notes and resources from today's show, go to greenleafbookgroup.com/episode 63. You can also find advice for writing, publishing, and promoting your work in my book, Ideas, Influence, and Income, which you can learn more about at ideasinfluenceandincome.com. If you've enjoyed our show, please rate and review us on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever it is you listen to your podcasts. It means a lot to have your feedback and helps us make sure we're answering your publishing questions. A big thank you to Eleanor Fishborn, who produces the Published podcast, and we will be back next month with another new episode.
Thanks for listening to Published. To learn more, please visit greenleafbookgroup.com. And remember to subscribe to this podcast on iTunes.